This video is on the peripheral nervous system. Now, we already had a video on the central nervous system, so make sure you watch that one first, because it kind of describes where the peripheral nervous system lies within our body's whole nervous system. Now, what we're going to start with is kind of where we left off in that video. So we left off with discussing how nerves come out from the spinal cord and how they come together to form spinal nerve roots. So we're going to take a closer look at spinal nerve roots. Alright, so what we're going to do is I'm going to try my best to draw a lateral view of your spinal cord and your spine, but it's not going to be a super accurate image. So just be aware of that it won't be exactly accurate in terms of how detailed everything is drawn. So lateral view. Alrighty. Let's start by drawing some vertebral bodies out. So I'm just going to draw those represented by a little square here. Alright, so I just drew 10 total little vertebral bodies here, okay? So let's go through and label those. So we're going to have C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7, and then remember that there are only 7 vertebral bodies in the cervical spine. Then we're going to move to the thoracic spine to go to T1, T2, T3. Okay? And they kind of get smaller as they go down. That wasn't intentional. Alrighty. So next we're going to have our spinal cord. So I'm going to draw that in right here. And it's going to keep going past T3, but that's just the only thing that I'm drawing out here. So just note that, of course, our spinal cord travels until about L1, L2. So this is just like a little bit of a cropped version of that. Now this big yellow thing is our spinal cord. I'm drawing it in yellow because in most textbooks and most references, any nerves in general will be drawn in yellow, especially the spinal cord. So here it is within, or kind of like posterior to the vertebral bodies. And then I'm also, just for our reference, going to draw like little spinous processes. And of course they don't look exactly like that, but just for our reference. Now, if you remember, we have spinal nerve roots that come out, and they come out from the spinal cord, and that is really the start of where the peripheral nervous system begins. As you recall, the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord, so now we're moving out of that area into our spinal nerve roots. Now, this isn't going to be exactly correct, because if we were looking at a lateral view here, we would have spinal nerve roots coming out on each side. So technically, if it was going to come out from like the left side, it would be coming out from the paper, and if it was coming out from the right side, it would come into the paper. But just to make it a little bit easier, I'm just going to draw like a little representation of the nerve roots, and it's going to just come forward. Okay, so let's first of all label, this is our spinal cord. Now we'll get into our nerve roots. So let's see. Let's make some nerve roots this purple color. So how it works is we have 7 cervical spine vertebrae, C1 through C7. Okay, each one is labeled individually based on the region of the spine it's in and then the number of the vertebrae it is. Now, what's different and what's kind of funky about our peripheral nervous system is that we actually have 8 cervical nerve roots. So we have C1 through C8. How that works is we're going to start up here with C1, the spinal nerve root coming out superior to C1. So this is going to be our spinal nerve roots. Then we're going to have C2 come out above C2, C3 come above C3, C4 come above C4, C5 come out above C5, C6 same thing, C7 same thing. But remember, now we're kind of switching things up. So I'm going to kind of bring in a color to help us recognize the fact that something changes here. So what's going to happen is we're going to have a C8, and this is going to be the mark for where everything changes. So this is our C8 nerve root. And I'm just going to note that I'm also drawing spinal nerve roots in green here. But I'm using the different color to make sure we recognize where things change. So we have our C8 coming out below C7. And then we're going to switch over into our thoracic spinal nerve roots. So we're going to go into T1, T2, T3, etc. So I'm going to just kind of like draw a circle around C8 because that's our big thing that changes everything up. So when we're looking at nerve roots superior to C8, they all exit above their assigned vertebrae. C1 exits above the C1 vertebrae, C7 exits above the C7 vertebrae, but C8 is the little weird one. Remember, there's not a vertebrae associated with it. So what happens is everywhere above or superior to C8, the nerve roots exit above their assigned vertebrae, and then everywhere below C8, the nerve roots exit below their assigned vertebrae. Now, remember that there is going to be, this isn't necessarily like an accurate representation because I'm drawing these nerve roots as if they're poking out superiorly, but they actually come out on the right and left side. So I'm just going to make a couple of notes here. Spinal nerve roots. There is right and left spinal nerve roots. And then for spinal nerve roots, they exit through a foramen. Remember all of those cranial nerves that we learned that exit through a specific foramen? Well, the spinal nerve roots exit through their own foramen, and that is called the intervertebral foramen. They exit through intervertebral foramen. So take a look at those in your spinal model pictures and the pictures in the textbook, because it will show you that there's like a little hole in which these spinal nerve roots are able to come out in between vertebrae, and that's what intervertebral means. It means in between vertebrae. So that's where spinal nerve roots come out. Okay, so now that we have a general idea of how spinal nerve roots come out in relation to vertebrae and where they come out, what I want us to do is I want us to take a closer look at some special areas where different nerve roots come out and they form something called a plexus. The first plexus of nerves we're going to review is called the brachial plexus. Now, remember that word brachial means arm. So this is going to be a plexus of nerves that's going to basically emerge out from the cervical region of the spinal cord and the upper thoracic region. And then it's going to basically be a collection of nerves that will make its way out to the upper extremity on both sides. A nerve plexus is a network of nerves that like intersect and are actually a little bit messy. So what I encourage you to do is look at a picture of the brachial plexus in your textbook just to reference what that actually looks like. But we're going to learn kind of like the basics of the brachial plexus, okay? So again, I'm going to draw vertebrae as boxes. So we're going to start with, let's do 6 vertebrae. I'm attempting to make these all look the same, but they don't, so. Alrighty. So we're starting at C4. And then we're making our way down to T1. Alrighty, so we're going to start with the first part of the brachial plexus, which comes out from C5, which starts with our nerve roots, okay? So let's take a look at the nerve roots that create this plexus. It's going to be our nerve root C5, which remember, above C8, things come out above the vertebrae that it corresponds with. So our C5 nerve root is going to come out above the C5 vertebrae. And we're also going to have C6, C7, and then this is where things change. Now C8 comes out inferior, and T1 comes out inferior, okay? So just like we drew in our last picture, these are our nerve roots. What comes next in terms of the brachial plexus is these nerve roots come out. Remember, nerve roots always come out on the right and left side of a vertebrae. And for these nerve roots, they're going to intertwine and intersection and form this thing called a brachial plexus. And the brachial plexus is divided up into 5 different sections. So the first one is the roots. Next, it forms trunks. Then it forms divisions. Next, there's cords. And finally, there's branches. So how this works is things start up at the spinal cord, which is right, where your neck is, because we're talking about the cervical spine and a little bit of the upper thoracic spine. And the nerves are going to intertwine. They're going to turn into trunks, divisions, cords, and then finally the branches are what are going to innervate the specific muscles in the upper extremity. So this plexus, for the most part, takes place in between the cervical spine and the shoulder, and then around there it starts to really break up into the different branches. Now let's talk about these different branches, because you'll likely recognize them because we've talked about them in our muscular system. So for these branches, actually, you know what? before I forget, I wanted to tell you there's a little acronym that can help you remember these things. And it is remember to drink cold beer. That's the one that I remember. There are a lot of different acronyms, or I'm sorry, there are mnemonics. There are a lot of different mnemonics for how to remember how these are listed from proximal to distal, and I'll actually make a little note of that we're speaking about proximal to distal. So if you don't like that one, feel free to look up a different mnemonic. Now, all right, so let's take a closer look into the different branches that are formed. We have axillary, which is the nerve that innervates our deltoid muscle. We have radial, which innervates our posterior arm and posterior forearm. We have median and ulnar, which both innervate our anterior forearm. And then lastly, we have musculocutaneous, which innervates our anterior arm. So that's really all you need to know about the brachial plexus. Just know that it is an organization of nerves that starts from our spinal cord, and it begins with nerve roots. Then it goes into all of these different things, finally ending in branches right around where the shoulder begins. And then it breaks up into all of these different nerves that end up innervating our different muscles, which allow those muscles to be activated when we want to use them. Okay, so now that we've looked at the brachial plexus for the upper extremity, I also want to look at something for the lower extremity, and that is our lumbosacral plexus. So I'm just going to draw a little line separating things out. So we have our lumbosacral plexus. Now for this, we have some different nerve roots, of course, because we're coming from the lumbar and the sacral region. So because of this, we're going to have our lumbar spine and our sacrum, but I'm just going to kind of give you a little bit of a shortcut so we don't quite have to draw everything out again. So we're going to have roots, and up here in the brachial plexus, it was C5 through T1. Here in the lumbosacral plexus, it's going to be L2 to S4. And just how the brachial plexus dealt with the upper extremity, the lumbosacral plexus will deal with the lower extremity. So what's important with this is, it's going to be very similar in that all of the nerves that we recognize from the lower extremity muscular lecture are going to be coming from the lumbosacral plexus. So let's write them out. Our branches are going to be femoral, which innervates the anterior thigh, obturator, which innervates the medial thigh, sciatic, which gets some posterior thigh and leg, tibial, which innervates our leg, and then common fibular, which is also known as common peroneal. Remember, peroneal is the older term that's used, and the fibular one is more, like up to date. And then, just so you remember, the common fibular is going to split up into superficial and deep fibular or peroneal. All right, so that covers what we need to know for plexuses. So we covered our brachial plexus, where the nerve roots come out, and then how they end up coming to form all of our branches. And that's how our muscles in our upper extremity have nerve supply to make sure that they can contract when we need them to. And then we also have our lumbosacral plexus, which innervates our lower extremity. And we talked about what nerve roots that it starts with, and then what branches it ends up with. And that's for it to innervate our lower extremity to make sure that we can do things like move our legs when we want to. Let's move on to the next component of our peripheral nervous system. That is our autonomic nervous system. Alrighty, so for this, as you hopefully recall from the central nervous system lecture, our autonomic nervous system is involuntary, so it occurs without us having active control over it. Now, it is split up into two different systems, and let's cover that, but what I want to do is I'm just going to draw a little picture of a brain and spinal cord, and then we're going to discuss where within that the autonomic nervous system branches off. So here's our little brain. I was just kind of making it as simplified as I can. There we go. That's our brain. And then I'm going to draw our spinal cord, which is going to come down like so. Alrighty, so let's start out. This is going to be a lateral view. It doesn't really matter about the view because we're not so much looking at the view, but we're looking at where the components of the autonomic nervous system branch off from our central nervous system. So, as I said, there are two main components of our autonomic nervous system, and let's start covering the first component, which is our parasympathetic nervous system. All right, so let's label it here. We have parasympathetic, and then the other component that we're going to cover, it's going to be our sympathetic nervous system. So I'll cover that here. And then I'm just going to draw a line to separate them. Alrighty, so starting with our parasympathetic, that is going to be our rest and digest system. So it is activated when we feel very calm, there are no threats around us, and we can focus on just resting and digesting. Now, our sympathetic is the opposite of that. It happens when we feel anxious or threatened in some way, and it's activated to create our fight or flight system. Now, our parasympathetic nervous system is coming out from our cranial nerve area here, and we have nerves coming out from our brain stem there, and then we also have nerves coming out from the sacral region, so here. And I'm going to draw one of them extended here. Alrighty, so it is our cranial nerve 3, 5, oops, excuse me, not 5, that's 7, 9, and 10. And then it also consists of the sacral region. Now for our sympathetic region, that will occur at C8 through L2. So let's mark that. C8, L2. Oops, oh no, I wrote something for our sympathetic nervous system in the wrong color. Let's make that right here. There we go. So C8 through L2. So we're gonna have nerves coming out here throughout that whole region. And I'm gonna draw one of them a little more extended here as well. Alrighty, so in terms of where our ganglion are, meaning our collection of cell bodies for these autonomic nervous system cells, or for these nerves, they're going to be in different locations for the parasympathetic and the sympathetic systems. So for the parasympathetic, we're going to have long preganglionic fibers and short postganglionic fibers. So here is our ganglion. It's our collection of cell bodies will always be represented as a dot. And then you can see that preganglionic, so we will start from the spinal cord and it comes out because this is the motor, like part of the motor system for the body. So it's gonna come out through the spinal cord, and then we're gonna have our ganglion, and then a little bit of a short postganglionic fiber. So let's write that down. Long preganglionic fibers and short postganglionic fibers. Okay? Now, for our sympathetic system, it's going to be the opposite. So we're going to have, let me just draw these guys in. And you know what? We can extend all of these. Why not, right? We'll make them all long. Just so we can better see the fact that our ganglion are in different spaces. All right. So for our sympathetic, we're going to have short preganglionic fibers and long postganglionic fibers. Now, the last component for both of these is the neurotransmitters. So that's what helps essentially communicate messages within these two systems. And you're going to learn more about neurotransmitters and physiology as well. So for the parasympathetic, we are going to have our neurotransmitter, and it is acetylcholine, sometimes abbreviated with ACH. And then lastly, for sympathetic, we're going to have our neurotransmitter And this one, it's actually going to be a little bit different. So we're going to split it up into pre-ganglionic. We're going to have acetylcholine. And then for post-ganglionic, we're going to have two different ones. The first one is epinephrine, and the second is norepinephrine. And we're actually going to learn a little bit more about those when we talk about the endocrine system, and you'll learn more in physiology as well. So this is our autonomic nervous system as a whole, and I just want to, as we're ending this component of the peripheral nervous system, I just want to point out that this is important because it's a part of our nervous system that is involuntary, so without our control. And it helps us when we're in a restful or digestive state. These are things that take care of that rest and take care of that digestion without us having control over it. And then also when we're in a very stressed or anxious state or under any sort of threat, our sympathetic system will take over and it'll get us into our fight or flight mode that we need to be in. Okay? So now we are just going to move on to the last component of our peripheral nervous system, and that is our cranial nerves. The final component of our peripheral nervous system is our cranial nerves. Now, I know that we already talked about our cranial nerves when we discussed the skull foramen. However, so, we already talked about the regions where all of the cranial nerves exit through those skull foramen. But now what I want to do is I want to review the names of the nerves and their function. Now, it might seem like our cranial nerves would be part of our central nervous system because the word cranial means brain, but they're technically part of our peripheral nervous system because they're branches out from our brain. So let's start just making our way through them. Our first one, or actually, you know what, just a heads up, I'm going to color code the functions of these nerves together. So basically you have like 3 different nerves that have to do with eyes. So I'm going to color code them based on that just to help us keep it nice and clear in our heads. But under your study guide for your cranial nerves, you're going to have a nice chart there with the cranial nerve, the number and the name, the function, and the foramen that the cranial nerve exits through. So reference that for a little more detail. Alright, so let's start with cranial nerve 1. And as a reminder, your cranial nerves are always written with Roman numerals. So cranial nerve 1 is olfactory. And what that means is smell. Alright, then we have cranial nerve 2. That is our optic nerve. By the way, there's an acronym, or excuse me, not an acronym, a mnemonic for remembering all of these different cranial nerves, numbers 1 through 12. And the mnemonic has to do with the first letter of the name of each of the 12 nerves. So there are plenty of them out there. I encourage you to just look that up online and find the one that works best for you. There is less appropriate version that a lot of people use. So I'm not going to discuss that in this video, but go ahead and Google it and find whichever one works best for you to remember the names of these nerves and how they're associated with the numbers. So our optic nerve, that helps, or the function of that is vision. Next is our cranial nerve number 3, and that is oculomotor. And this is exactly what it sounds like. Oculo is eye, motor is movement. So it does eye movement, and I'm just coloring it blue because it is also having to do with the eyes, just like cranial nerve 2. This nerve helps with specific eye movement. So what I encourage you to do is go ahead and look, just like reference the eye muscles in the muscular lecture that we looked at, and that will tell you which specific eye movements that oculomotor cranial nerve basically facilitates. Now our next cranial nerve number 4, is our trochlear nerve. You should also recognize that from our muscular system lecture, and that's also going to do eye movement, but again, reference that lecture for more detail on this. Cranial nerve number 5 is our trigeminal nerve, and it's actually going to have multiple different components. So the first component, they use the components, and essentially they're all numbered, but instead of using Roman numerals, they are using just like regular numbers. So for 1, it does sensation of forehead and nose. So number 2 does sensation of maxillary and zygomatic areas. And number 3 does sensation of mandible, and it also does mastication, which is chewing. So there's actually a pretty easy way to remember this. If you look at your face and you separate it into 3 different sections from superior to inferior, the first component of trigeminal nerve does the most superior part, the second component does the middle part, and then the last component does the most inferior part, and mastication, which takes place at your mandible. Alright, so that covers our trigeminal nerve. Next, we have our cranial nerve number 6. Oh, by the way, for each of the components of the trigeminal nerve, it'll be written as cranial nerve 5, just like this with Roman numerals, but then they'll put the like regular number right after that. So it'll say cranial nerve 5 1, cranial nerve 5 2. Okay. Alrighty. So cranial nerve number 6. That is our abducens nerve. And I'm going to color that in this navy blue because it also does eye movement. But just as the name sounds, abducens, it abducts the eye, so it moves it laterally. Okay, next we have cranial nerve 7. That's our facial nerve. And see, these names really do connect with the function very well, so it should be relatively easy to kind of group together, or at least like it should help with that grouping of things together. Now, there are a few different functions here. The functions of facial nerve are very similar to the functions of cranial nerve number 9, glossopharyngeal, so I'm going to use the same colors. Let's see. Yeah. Alrighty, so let's pick one. Here we go. So facial nerve, we're going to have facial expression. So it's going to innervate all of those facial muscles we learned about in the muscular lecture. It's going to do both salivation, so creating saliva, and lacrimation, which is tears. And then it's going to do taste of the tongue, but it's actually only going to do the anterior 2/3 of it. Okay, our next one is vestibulocochlear. That is cranial nerve 8. And it's exactly what the name sounds like. So vestibulo is balance because of our vestibule, and that's something that will be covered in the sensory lecture or special senses lecture. And then the cochlear is referring to hearing. So those are the two functions of this nerve. We have balance and hearing. So next we have cranial nerve number 9. And that is our glossopharyngeal nerve. And remember, that's the one that's really similar to facial nerve. So it doesn't do facial expression, but it does something in sort of that like facial region, which is it supplies motor to the pharynx. And go ahead and you can look up what the pharynx is. We're going to learn about it in more detail when we get into that system. But just kind of look up what it is and get a little visual of it, and then kind of tuck that away for later when we review it in more detail. Now, here are the two components that are exactly or almost exactly the same as the facial nerve. So the glossopharyngeal nerve also does salivation. It just doesn't do the lacrimation that facial nerve does. And then it fills in the gaps for the rest of the taste. So facial nerve did the anterior 2/3, so this is going to do the posterior 1/3. Next is our cranial nerve number 10, vagus nerve. I always kind of remember that because it sounds like Las Vegas, and then I picture some sort of like show in Las Vegas with people like rating people 10 out of 10. So anyway, I have funky ways of remembering things. So vagus nerve is kind of on its own in terms of function. It is very, very important. One of the most important cranial, I mean, they're all important, but this one helps us with talking and swallowing. And then it also supplies our viscera. So in doing that, it does parasympathetic innervation. To the heart, lungs, and the GI system, which is basically your digestive system. Now I'm going to do these last two in the same color as well because they're unique in that they both do motor to some specific muscles. So we have our cranial nerve 11, and that is our spinal accessory. Just FYI, if you're looking up some of the mnemonics for the cranial nerves, some of them will use the A in spinal accessory for the mnemonic, so don't worry about that. It might be confusing at first. Alright, so spinal accessory, it does, if you remember from our muscle chart, it does motor to trapezius and sternocleidomastoid muscles. And remember, MM is the abbreviation for muscles. And SCM is the abbreviation for sternocleidomastoid. Now, our last but not least cranial nerve is cranial nerve 12. And that is our hypoglossal. Make sure you don't get that confused with glossopharyngeal because they both have the word gloss in it. The glosso refers to the tongue. So remember how this one has taste in it? And then it also, the second part, pharyngeal, has to do with the pharynx. Well, the hypoglossal also has to do with the tongue, but for hypoglossal, it's a little bit different, and it actually does tongue movement. And so I grouped that with cranial nerve 11 just because it does those motor components. Again, whenever I'm color coding anything, you never have to be in line with my colors. It's just kind of how I organize things in my brain. Always feel free to just do everything in black and like draw little lines to label things. But I found after years of studying this stuff that it helps to have some color coding to organize things. Alright, so that concludes our cranial nerves, and this is the end of the peripheral nervous system lecture.